guest is Ben Sherwood. I had an opportunity to meet Ben about 6 months ago, and we've met up a couple times since then. And the first time I met Ben, I was sort of inspired by the path that he's taken in his life, and figured he'd be a great person to eventually interview for the Quality of Life Project. Ben's background is very, when you hear about his background, I'll tell you in a second. What struck me when I first met Ben was he was a person that was very multidimensional, very curious about life, and with just an overall hunger for the different joys that are out there for us if we explore a little bit. Ben grew up in Los Angeles. Out here, he went to Harvard, was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and spent a lot of his professional career in the journalism and media world. He was executive producer at Good Morning America, as well as NBC Nightly News, and had some very interesting as well as dramatic assignments, whether in Sarajevo or in New York after 9/11. Ben took I wouldn't say 180 degrees turn to becoming a writer, since I'm sure he uses a lot of his skills from the journalism world and what he does today, but a pretty dramatic shift in leaving he was already at a high level in that world, but certainly more to even aspire to if he wanted to become a writer. And he went on to write books like The Man Who Ate a 747, The Death and Life of Charlie McCloud, which is now being made into a movie with Zac Efron. And his most recent book is The Survivors Club, which is not only a New York Times bestseller, but has become a movement in itself. And if you all go to the website, thesurvivorsclub.org, you will see for yourself very inspirational array of stories and such. So when I first met Ben, I knew he'd be a good interview for this. A lot of times I get questions from the audience and people with the site, how do we decide who to interview for this? And there's nothing, there's no scientific methodology. We don't claim to be the arbiters for a life well lived, etc. But I would say we look for people that we think have a good and positive approach to life. People that are accomplished, but also don't take themselves too seriously. People that overall have an approach that leads to, I guess you could say, a contented enjoyment of life. The one challenge with that is that the people that we found that have a lot to inspire and a lot to share are also the people that don't think they have all the answers. So it definitely takes a lot of prodding for people like Ben included to say, hey, no one thinks you have all the answers, but just we'd love to interview and just have you share with the audience the different things. Anyway, we're gonna afterwards tonight. There's going to be drinks outside. The company Adina Worldwide is our drink sponsor, and I hope you all will stay a little bit afterwards. And also during the event, during the course of the evening, say hello to people around you. I think that's a good backdrop. It's a good opportunity to meet people as well. Thank you, Robert Graves, San Juan Library, for helping us put this on. Let's kick things off. I'm going to interview Ben for about 30 minutes. First, he's going to talk about 5 to 10 minutes about his background, what he's up to these days, and then we'll definitely keep a solid 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So I'm going to pass it on to Ben. If you could just tell everyone a little bit about your background, story, and what you're up to these days, that'd be great.
Thank you, Kit. Thank you all very much for coming tonight on a cold Santa Monica night to a warm place, and a beautiful place too. What a beautiful room. Robert, thank you so much for making my day. Robert mentioned earlier this evening when we met that my first novel, The Man Who Ate the 747, is one of his staff picks on the Santa Monica Library recommended book reading list. And that when people are searching for a good novel, he recommends it. And that's sort of the nicest thing you could possibly say to an occasional novelist. That's a book about a guy who loves a girl so much in the middle of America, in Nebraska, that he sets about eating a 747 to prove his love for her. Oh. And another guy from the Guinness Book of World Records, who's the protagonist of the novel, comes to a little town in the Midwest to verify whether this is in fact happening, because it would be quite a record for the Guinness Book of Records. and he proceeds to fall in love with the same girl. And all sorts of things ensue. It's based, by the way, upon a character named Michel Tito of France, who ingested a Cessna light aircraft in the 1970s and is the only man to have eaten an airplane. Shortly after he did that, Guinness banned eating records at that time because a man in Nigeria was trying to eat an office building, and Guinness thought, we can't do this anymore. Quality of life is a topic that I wouldn't say is top of mind, but it's something that has guided many of my decisions in life. And in particular, I can think of one specific decision that I share with you as we kick this conversation off. I used to have probably the worst possible quality of life as a television news producer when I ran Good Morning America. That's the 7 to 9 o'clock show on ABC, hosted for about another couple weeks by Diane Sawyer and Robin Roberts. When I worked there, it was with Charlie Gibson and Diane Sawyer. And that's a program where you get up every morning at 3:45 a.m. You get your first phone call at about 3:46. And you talk to the overnight team about what happened while you were sleeping. And then you jump in the shower and you go to work at 4:09. And based upon street traffic at that hour and the way we had sort of timed it out, I was able to hit the door at 4:24, and Diane Sawyer usually walked in at 4:30, so I had about 6 minutes to get into my desk, get a bowl of Cheerios, and look at the rundown. That's a job where most people would think that ends when you're off the air at 9 o'clock in the morning, but in fact, at 9 in the morning, after 2 hours of live, crazy, wild television, you proceed to go to work. Because at 9 o'clock, I would get into a car and drive uptown to the offices of Good Morning America, where about 125 people and I began to work. We only had 22 hours until the next show was on the air. And so it was sort of like a sprint until I collapsed at around usually 9 o'clock at night and would be able to go to sleep usually around 10 and was up again, as I told you, right around 3:45 for that first phone call. My wife, who was pregnant when I took the job and had our first son not long after I had been there, my wife calculated that if I had averaged around 7 hours of sleep per night in regular life, after 2.5 years of running Good Morning America, I had a sleep deficit of 1,600 hours. So I would just say, off the top, to me, sleep is the single most important determinant of quality of life. It's taken a couple of years, to be perfectly honest, to recover, not the sleep that I lost, because scientists tell us that that kind of sleep is unrecoverable. You can't make up what you have given away in terms of being up. But it's taken a couple of years, actually, to get back to a normal rhythm of sleep. I used to, for about a year after leaving that job, I used to wake up at around 3:30 and immediately wonder if we had a satellite truck in Florida for the hurricane that was about to hit. That was the first thing that I would think. To Kit's question, what I've been doing recently after the Survivors Club came out in January, we have an online venture called thesurvivorsclub.org, which is a resource center for people facing every kind of adversity, whether it's a health challenge, financial challenge, a family challenge. And we are publishing high-quality content and resources and guides for people who need to know the secrets of other survivors who've been through breast cancer, who've been through prostate cancer, who've handled foreclosure, who have been challenged by domestic violence. And we are gathering and publishing reliable, trustworthy resources for people who want to know the secrets of surviving and thriving in the face of a variety of challenges. And so that has occupied a lot of my time, thesurvivorsclub.org, and I've also begun to work on a new book that grew out of a lot of the thinking that animates the Survivors Club. I should say that a lot of the themes of survivorship and that I've been thinking about for the last 3 years are ideas that are very relevant to the questions of quality of life and what makes life worthwhile, what makes life meaningful, what is a good, contented life, to use the word that Kit used. I just want to say at the outset that I define surviving, survivorship, not the way most people would define it as making it through the day. I define surviving very much in parallel with the notion of thriving. That is, surviving to me is making the most of the time that you have as you define it. To repeat it, and there's a couple of different ingredients that I hope over the course of the evening we can break down and actually discuss. Making the most of the time you have as you define it. So a cancer survivor or a mountain lion attack survivor or a plane crash survivor, I met survivors around the world during the course of my research. And what I found most was that the people with the highest quality of life were those who were living their lives fully by their own definition. Not by some external definition that being a good cancer survivor means walking in the breast cancer walk, raising money for breast cancer, speaking at schools about breast cancer, and being an advocate. Sometimes the best breast cancer survivors that I interviewed were people who defined a full life differently. They didn't see giving back as the definition of a full life. Rather, they thought that being a good grandmother was the definition of a full life, and that's how they wanted to spend their time. Another part of this is the idea of time. And again, I met survivors who lived 4 weeks after facing a particular challenge and then perished. And I met survivors who lived 40 years after overcoming an extraordinary ordeal. 4 weeks or 40 years, their quality of life, whether it was 4 weeks or 40 years or 4 months, they made the most of their time as they defined it. They lived fully for 4 weeks or for 4 months. And I saw that again and again. And so those are just 2 ideas I wanted to put out there at the beginning. Working on a new book, running a couple of web ventures, and trying to be a good husband, and also the father of a 5-year-old named Will, who is a baseball and karate obsessive.
Thank you, Ben. And I just can't imagine anything more interesting than sitting down with someone like you and talking about these kind of things. So tell us, what are the greatest life lessons that you learned through the 3 years of working on this book?
So it's a big question, and I think that there are 3 pillars of survivorship and quality of life that I don't articulate as succinctly as I will tonight in the book, because the book sort of takes a different tack. But in thinking about our conversation tonight, sort of tried to distill some of the ideas about quality of life from hundreds of people around the world I interviewed, and then the experts who study survivors. There's a whole category of expert, academics, researchers, psychologists, geneticists, who are sociologists, who look from many different disciplines at the qualities that make some people highly effective survivors and thrivers, people who overcome adversity and then live high quality lives. I'd say the first quality is adaptability. And adaptability is a concept that I think sort of sounds obvious, but it's surprisingly not easy. Adaptability means the capacity to change your attitudes and actions in response to a new environment. Sort of in classic evolutionary sense, it means that when something big happens in your environment, you can change your attitudes and actions to respond. When it comes to a factory closing, or your job being on the line, or your 401k envelope arriving in the mail, adaptability means changing your attitudes and actions, recognizing that there is a particular challenge that you face, perhaps unemployment in the community, a declining economy, and changing your actions in response to it. So not only are you aware that there's something happening with your local economy, but also you're able to change your actions in response. Fascinating fact from the people who counsel unemployed people in the United States today. Turns out that a surprising number of people, overwhelming majority of people, wait until they are fired to begin to seek or train for a new job. So they actually are aware that there's dislocation in the economy, they're aware that there are challenges to a local business, but they actually wait until they are given the pink slip to do something about it. That's not adaptability. Adaptability is recognizing that things are changing and adjusting your response to that new reality. And so people who have high quality of life and people who are really good survivors and thrivers are highly adaptable, they're flexible. They are not rigid. They don't refuse to believe that things are changing. We all practice something called the normalcy bias. Psychologists have a phrase, the normalcy bias, to describe that we all have a bias toward things staying the way they are. So even when shoppers go to get their goods in department stores where there's a fire burning in several of the aisles, there is video that shows people going to the cash registers to pay for their goods, even though the department store is on fire. That's the normalcy bias in its purest form. People go about their business, buying their cereal and their toothpaste, while the racks are burning. The second quality, I think, that is indispensable to quality of life is resilience. And resilience is the capacity, sort of from the Latin resilience, to reconstitute, to take your original form after you've been bent out of shape. So if you bend something, resilience is the capacity to bounce back and return to original form. There's a big genetic component to it. Scientists are discovering that there is something known as the 5-HTT, or serotonin transporter gene, which is a gene that is believed to be associated with the capacity of some people to withstand tremendous stress and strain in life. It just sort of washes off them like water on the duck. And there are other people who do not have that genetic predisposition, and so they suffer more and they have more difficulty coming back after life's toughest knocks. Resilience is genetic, and it's also something that is like a muscle. It's a learnable quality, it's a practicable thing, and there is an entire resilience prescription that we can talk about building your resilience almost like going to the gym. There are things that you can do. I visited the god of resilience studies, Dennis Charney, at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and he has a 10-step plan to boost your resilience. Even if you don't feel genetically like you have that in you, you can do things to become a more resilient person. And then finally, very quickly, there's something that I guess one could call realistic optimism. And I think that almost of all the qualities, adaptability is critical, resilience is important, but optimism, I think, particularly in terms of quality of life, is indispensable. And realistic optimism is this interesting notion that Jim Collins writes about in his book Good to Great. When Admiral James Stockdale, the highest ranking prisoner of war in Vietnam, was asked who lived and who died in the prisoner of war camps of Vietnam, Stockdale answered paradoxically that it was the optimists who died first. Collins was puzzled by that. How could it be that the optimists would be the first to die? And Stockdale answered that optimists believed that at Christmas they would be released. The optimists believed that by New Year's they would go home. The optimists believed that on Thanksgiving they would finally have their freedom. And each time their spirits were crushed, their hopes were dashed, and they were still in captivity being tortured. And they lost hope, gave up, and perished. Realistic optimism, Stockdale believes, is the capacity to brutally face the facts of your life. Really to understand and deal with the reality of what you face, but to maintain a positive attitude, a hopefulness that things are going to get better and that things can get better. And it's that combination of realistic optimism that I think, again, in many of the people that I've met, they have a higher quality of life. A corollary to that realistic optimism, and I'll stop, is a connected, engaged life. Because when they study people who have quality of life and they study people who are really good survivors and thrivers, they find, and we can unpack this, there's some fascinating science about this, that isolated people who don't come on Wednesday nights to gatherings at public libraries to engage with other people who stay at home, people who are isolated and cut off, have a much higher risk of all sorts of health, physical and mental health problems. You have a much lower survival rate after heart attacks and other major health problems. And so a connected, engaged life, especially with other people, is another part of this idea of, it's a sort of a corollary of an optimistic and hopeful life too.
That's interesting when you were talking about the optimism, and from our research, the interviews that we've done, I've definitely seen sort of the existence of the kind of dichotomy principle where one person had talked about how there's definitely a negative aspect to a sense of entitlement, right? Thinking that things should come to us, but at the same time, there's also can be a positive side to a sense of entitlement in terms of, why not me? Why shouldn't I be able to get all the fruits that life has to offer? Why shouldn't my company be able to take on, the biggest competitors in the industry? So it's interesting you mentioned on that. So it seems also that, on the theme of survivorship, that a lot has to do with sort of, not just attitude, but just, judgment and making good decisions in certain situations. So what are some things that maybe someone can do in their practice in their life that maybe puts them in a position to have greater judgment or make better decisions? I don't know what's behind that.
So in military training, and I went through the Air Force's wilderness survival course for this book, and also the Navy's water survival school. They teach an idea that fighter pilots know and that commercial aircraft pilots know. They teach this concept of deliberate calm. And deliberate calm is a forcing yourself in a tough situation to engage in a purposeful, deliberate calm. Now, those of you who practice yoga are familiar with that sort of breathing. My wife practices, and sometimes I see her doing a certain kind of breathing when she's trying to kind of force herself almost to calm down in a stressful situation. Those of you who served in uniform may know about combat breathing, which is a concept of very stressful situations in the military where men and women in uniform are trained to engage in kind of stress reduction breathing, combat breathing, to kind of get themselves centered and ready to engage in a task. Deliberate calm is the same idea. Sully Sullenberger, the captain of Flight 1549 US Air, talks about this deliberate calm that they went through their checklist, they hit the flock of geese, they went through their checklist, they felt very, very calm because they sort of trusted their system, they trusted their checklist, and they had enough training to get to that place. So you don't have to go through the training that I've described to take a deep breath. And it sounds like a cliche. It really does sound like a cliche, just take a deep breath. How many times has someone said that to you? But the reality is that there is science to support this idea that to make good decisions, practicing deliberate calm can lead you to make a better decision in a crisis situation. There's also a very big component to this that involves instinct. Instinct, just sort of knowing what to do. And some of us instinctively handle pressure in certain ways. Some of us don't handle it well. And in fact, in this room tonight, if something terrible were to happen all of a sudden, we all faced a challenge, 10% of us, and this is research that goes back to World War II and before World War II, to all kinds of emergencies and crises, 10% of us would respond calmly, purposefully, with quick decisions, and would lead others out of an emergency. 80% of us, myself included, would become bewildered, go into a stupor, denial, and wait for someone, probably Robert from the library, to tell us what to do. We would wait for someone in a position of authority to give us instructions and snap us out of it. And 10% of us would do the wrong thing. we would behave in a negative, counterproductive, self-destructive way. So, in response to your question, Kit, one of the questions for survivors and thrivers, people who want to deal with all of life's challenges, is how do you flip the switch from inaction to action? How do you become a person, and it's not just emergencies, it's all of the things that we face in life. How do you become a person who gets off the couch instead of staying on the couch when you face bad news? How do you become a person who goes out and seeks out information? Information seeking is a very big part of surviving and thriving. How do you become an information seeker when you're afraid of what the information is going to tell you? Or you're too stunned and bewildered and in a stupor or in denial because of what you've found out or what you know is happening to a friend that you're trying to help. And it's that question, it's flipping the switch from inaction to action, that I think is sort of one of the most fascinating questions. Because ordinary people, folks like all of us, do the most unbelievable things every single day to live better lives, to survive and to thrive in the face of adversity. And I was fascinated by how they do that. How do these superheroes of survival, as I call them, how do they get out of bed every day when they're dealing with 5 different primary cancers? Not metastatic cancer with 5 different metastases, but people who have 5 different primary cancers. Those are the people who are interesting at cancer hospitals. The cancer creators, the cancer makers, their bodies are like cancer factories, making all these different kinds of cancers. I wanted to meet them and find out how they pick themselves up and go through their days and how they do it. Because if they can do it, surely the rest of us can do it with the challenges that we face.
Very interesting. And I'm going to ask you one more question sort of related to the book and then shift into more quality of life in general. But you mentioned that the 3 things you learned that apply to quality of life from your book, you mentioned the last one, people sort of going out and getting information, kind of more of a proactive approach. And it made me think of that study that you mentioned on your website in the UK. I think it was a professor in the UK about luck, and I think you called it the science of luck. And if you could share with everyone, because I think it ties into what you're talking about at that point.
So, show of hands, how many of you consider yourselves to be lucky people? Like you have good luck in your lives? And how many of you consider yourselves to be, and how many of you consider yourselves to be unlucky? Like you have bad luck in life? So Richard Wiseman is a professor in the United Kingdom, a psychologist who has studied the science of luck for the last 10 years. And we all think of luck as random, sort of happens. Wiseman has a totally different theory, in that he believes that a small percentage of the things that happen to us are truly out of our control. But he actually believes that most of what happens to us is in our control, and lucky people and unlucky people are actually different. They behave differently. Their orientation to the world is different. So let me illustrate how he proves this. Wiseman gives groups of people a newspaper, and he asks them to go through the paper and to count the number of photos in the paper. And usually it takes half of the group around 30 seconds to do this, and it takes the other half of the group around 3 minutes to do it. Now, it's not because half of the world counts pictures better than the other half of the world. It's because on page 3 of this newspaper that he's given to these test subjects, there's a giant headline, and it says, there are 43 pictures in this newspaper. A few pages later, there's another headline that says, really, there are 43 pictures in this paper. Tell the researcher now and you'll get $200.
Wow.
Interestingly, Wiseman has found that people who see themselves as lucky notice those headlines in the paper and report to the researcher they saw it. And people who describe themselves as unlucky tend not to see the headlines and instead count all the pictures. So what does that tell Wiseman and us about what is luck. Who finds money on the street? Who has chance encounters with investors who are looking to spend money on business ideas? Who meets the woman of her dreams or the man of her dreams at the dry cleaner? Those people, Wiseman says, are people who are more open to the world around them, who have a less neurotic, in a psychological sense, less neurotic approach to life, who have greater networks of luck, that is, more people who are mixing through their lives every day. They tend to be more open to possibilities, whereas the unlucky people tend to be more narrow, focused on a task, get it done, worry about whether they're doing it right and getting it right. And he says this applies to all aspects of life. Richard Wiseman actually says that most of us could increase the lucky events in our lives by as much as 40% if we practiced a series of simple adjustments in our lives to increase our openness to good things happening. Do we have time for one more quick story about this?
Absolutely.
One more quick story. I was asked by the Oprah magazine to write a little bit more about this subject. They're very interested in the idea of chance encounters. And they approached me earlier this year and asked if I could apply some of my techniques, some stories about real people and some science to this question of chance encounters. Do they really happen? What is a chance encounter? And how can you increase the likelihood of chance encounters in your life? And so I started talking to experts and found that in psychology there is an entire field that studies chance encounters. And I called a woman at the University of Michigan, a professor, who has written about chance encounters in something that is called cognitive encoding. Cognitive encoding, and forgive me if you all know what this means, but it's this idea, she says, that if you need toilet paper and you don't have any next to your toilet, and you make a note, I really need toilet paper. When you go out during the day, this is a very reductionist example, but when you go out during the day and you happen upon a giant roll of toilet paper, you may think, wow, what a lucky encounter. I bumped into this giant roll of toilet paper. I happen to need that at home. And you describe yourself as lucky. And you think of that as a lucky event or a fortuitous event or even a chance encounter because you've engaged in something called cognitive encoding. You've predicted the need for something, you've encoded it in your mind, and then when you encounter it, it's sort of waiting for you to retrieve it, and it feels like chance. I know this sounds very, very base, but it's sort of something that she says, she explains, applies in lots of different ways when we actually encounter something that we think is by chance, but we actually have prepared it in our minds. So I said to her, at the end of this interview, this is never going to work in an Oprah magazine article, because this is about how do I make that seem interesting for Oprah's readers? Has this ever happened to you? And not applied to toilet paper or toothpaste? And she said, yes, as a matter of fact, it has. She got tenure at the University of Michigan on a Friday night. It's a hard thing to do to get tenure, right? She worked for, I think, 7 years to get tenure. Every weekend in the lab, not a lot of friends, not much dating, just work, publish. On a Saturday morning, after getting tenure, going out with not very many people because she didn't have that many friends to go celebrate with, she woke up and she said to herself, I need to change my life. I need to find someone. I spent all this time getting tenure. What I really want is a relationship. I want a family. I need to do something about that. She got in her car. She drove over to her dry cleaner. She was handing over her dry cleaning to the guy who takes it every Saturday when she does her routine on the way to work. And the guy said to her as she handed over a blouse, is that a dress? She looked at him and she said, dress? I would never wear anything that short. Are you kidding me? And she wrote down her phone number on the little ticket, and she then blurted out, you got my number, are you going to call me? Which was totally out of character. Something she would never do. She couldn't believe she was saying those words. That night at 7 o'clock, that guy at the dry cleaner called her. Want to go to the movies? They're married and have a child now. She had encoded her memory to be available and more open to the possibility of a relationship. When she went to pick up her dry cleaning, something came blurting out because she had encoded it that morning when she woke up. And that was what you would call a chance encounter with the guy at the dry cleaner. But in fact, that was the guy who had taken her laundry for years. But she was aware and open to it all of a sudden. So luck in our lives is something that we may think is random, just happens to us passively. But in fact, for quality of life and for good things to happen, a lot of it has to do with sort of an openness to it, an awareness and a receptivity to it, as Professor Wiseman would say.
Yeah, and I guess, when we tend to think about our futures, we always think that it is sort of semi-mapped out. But I think if we look at our past lives and break down our past, it definitely gets pretty minute in terms of series of small decisions and opportunities. Kind of shifting big picture on the overall subject of quality of life. What do you think are some important perspectives for someone to carry throughout their life in terms of a life well lived? So if you were talking to Will, is that your question, now or several years later?
So first of all, I just want to stipulate that this is outside of my area of expertise, and I tried to talk Kit out of doing this because I sort of know a lot about this subject in terms of quality of life. I've had less of it, I've had more of it. So just I stipulate, forgive me for the disclaimer.
Yeah.
As you said at the beginning, I don't consider that I have the answers, but I would definitely say that
We'll just pretend we're drinking a couple of pints of beer here, and these guys happen to be here.
I think that the quality that has meant the most to me in life in terms of a high quality of life, and the thing that I would try to inculcate, and I'm trying to inculcate in our son Will, is curiosity. Because I think that a person who asks questions is never lost. And a person who asks questions is always discovering and can always find ways of solving problems and of making things better. And I would just say that the thing that I do, it's strange, and I think I could hardly prescribe this as a recommendation for anybody else, but the thing that I do to soothe myself, believe it or not, it's weird, to find contentment, is I go online and I go read about what's happening in the world, and I go searching down rabbit holes, looking at interesting things. My wife jokes that sort of I get up very, very early in the morning and I go do my gathering. And my gathering involves, now thanks to the internet, I go off all over the world most days and read local newspapers all around the world and read feature stories and human interest stories and science stories, and I find that to be satisfying my curiosity, the thing that makes me absolutely the happiest. And I know that there is this incredible tool that is free for the time being that allows me to go anywhere and do anything, just like that. So I think that curiosity is the quality and curiosity is the thing that leads to my love of travel, and not travel, sort of grand travel, which one gets to do as a journalist, but travel around the city, travel to different neighborhoods, experiencing different cultures, different things. It's the reason that I love journalism. It's the reason that I write books. It's the reason that I love meeting people, is the satisfying the curiosity of going and asking questions, meeting new people, and seeing new things. I really do believe this idea that the person who asks questions can't get lost and can always find answers to make things better.
Mm-hmm. And does it entail also sort of a willingness to be naive in some circumstances? Because it seems a lot of people, even in high positions or that seemingly successful, might not be willing to look uninformed in the situation? Or does that come into play a little bit, you think?
I think my wife Karen would say that one of the things about my personality is I'm not at all afraid of all of the things that I do not know. And I'm not afraid of starting absolutely at the very, very bottom, again, of some mountain in an attempt to get to the top of it by learning. And a good example, I mean, the direct answer to your question is yes, you have to be prepared to not know lots of things. My wife has worked in the movie business for a very long time, 23, 24 years. And she has become, through hard work and her talent, has become quite an expert on the things that she does in the movie business. I have had multiple careers over the last 20 years, and I have this need almost every few years to start completely over in a brand new area or a brand new field and begin knowing absolutely nothing, and put myself on a nearly vertical learning curve and climb as fast as I can straight up by learning things. I'm working on a brand new book that's about animals and ideas from the animal world that can help us all in the lives and the challenges and the problems that we face. As I was researching the book behind me, I kept on running into incredible research about how animals have already solved many of the problems that we all live with. And health problems, social problems, family problems, sexual problems, all kinds of problems, the animals around us, they've already got them figured out. And there are researchers studying them, and I was intrigued by this, and so that's the new book. But I'm starting in a place, I'm starting at the absolute rock bottom of this mountain, because I'm learning, I have to start from a place of learning a lot about animals in order to be able to write intelligently about primates and self-medication, for instance. It's a fascinating idea that animals have learned through evolution. I hope people believe in this idea that there is something called evolution, and that animals over time have evolved by doing certain things to increase their likelihood of survival. Many animals self-medicate. If they have a stomach ache, chimps know which plants to eat to deal with the stomach ache, and they eat those plants purposefully. And they somehow either teach or know that those are the plants to eat if they have a stomach ache. In order to write about chimps intelligently, you have to read a lot about chimps and interview a lot of experts about chimps and not know a lot. And part of the process right now is writing emails, again, God bless the internet, writing emails to researchers around the world, asking them, can I interview you? I was just in touch today with a researcher in Japan who is the god of primate self-medication.
Wow.
And he enthusiastically said, of course you can interview me, I can't wait, here are all my articles, here's everything you need to know. And part of my fear, of course, I have this fear, but it's also very exciting, is sometime in the next couple weeks, I get to call this guy and talk to the world's leading expert on primate self-medication. He's the guy who spotted this when he noticed a chimp was sick and ignoring its screaming child. And the chimp was sick and didn't feel well and seemed to have a stomach ache, and then went and began to eat from a plant that he had never seen a chimp eat from. And then the chimp was better the next day, and then he began to study the dung of chimps and began to realize that chimps that had stomach problems had a higher concentration of certain plants in them, and they were clearly eating that plant to deal with the stomach problem. He's written extensively on this. Just as a quick focus group, do you mind? How many people find that interesting? Or is it just like me sitting in my room thinking, wow, this is completely fascinating? There is that slight quality when you're going down these rabbit holes of curiosity. And you and I talked about this at lunch the other day, which is anyone in the entire world going to find this remotely interesting?
That's great. I like that. In all of our interviews with different people, there's sort of commonalities and things like productivity, family relations, exercise. going into the productivity one, kind of making the most of time, are there any little practices that you do in your life that help you on the productivity front? Would you say that's an area that you've got some useful practices that maybe others might be able to latch onto, maybe?
I think I'm a sure. I mean the thing that my parents taught us, me and my sister, and
Something you've been doing a long time?
yeah, I mean I'm laughing again. It will sound terribly obvious to all of you, but I do believe that it's the secret of how I've managed to get a lot of the things done is I start earlier than anybody else when it's really, really quiet and there are no interruptions. I mean, I started earlier, like at 3:45 early for a long time, but I start earlier and I go later. And it's in the quiet before the world kind of starts that I get the most done in the morning and at night. And I think that maybe dissecting that idea a little bit, the key that I found to productivity is the lack of interruptions from the banging on the door of everything that's happening now, whether it's your BlackBerry or email or phone calls and the rest. I'm much more productive when it's very, very quiet and there are very few interruptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And on a day-to-day basis, are you one of those people that if you're climbing a line at a bank or something that you sort of have some reading with you, or kind of?
Yeah, no. So I'm not that guy. I don't carry my book bag with me anymore. But I definitely have definitely always have something to write with, because I find those times in the bank line or in traffic or the rest. That's when I think that a lot of problem solving happens, and a lot of ideas come popping out, and I've got to write them down. I just got the new iPhone. And I've had various recorders that I've carried around, but my son, who was 5, managed to show me that there is this thing on the iPhone that all of you probably know about that I did not know about, which is this thing where you can record like a little voice memo to yourself, which is fantastic because it allows me, instead of now writing, I can just say them, and then periodically I'll find that my son has gotten a hold of this and has left me an entire message about how he wants to trade several of the Dodger pitchers for Adam Wainwright and Chris Carpenter. But that's, again, in terms of productivity, this tool, I'm just beginning to learn all of the secrets of productivity and being able to remember ideas.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Jumping back to the sleep thing, besides valuing sleep and getting up early, and if there's nothing here, you don't have to talk about it, but any things that you do that help you sleep, help you go to sleep, help you sleep deeper?
So,
sorry? I just didn't know what I was talking. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah.
There's nothing here because I am one of the lucky people who can fall asleep in the middle of one of my wife's sentences on the first breath. I mean, she does not fall asleep easily, and I, the second I lie down, can be asleep. I'm very lucky that way. So I have it's always been that way. I can sleep pretty much anywhere, at any time, for a short amount of time, for a long amount of time, and it takes no time to get it going.
The other subject, kind of a commonality I mentioned, was with family, and I don't know about everyone here, but for me, a lot of my quality of life also has to do with absence of problems and drama and repair and things like that. And so for me personally, 90% of my stress and problems end up being family related, and I aspire to be more skilled in how I handle relationships, how I avoid missteps and things like that. And just real curious about your perspectives on that. Any things you've gotten better at over the years in that area? If I'm, again, one of your, someone who's kind of trying to tap your experiences in life, any things you do in that whole family relationships kind of thing, along those lines?
Well, I made, in romantic comedy terms, I was the guy in the romantic comedy who is careening toward disaster in terms of life and everything. And then the very last possible second, I met my wife Karen, and so I would absolutely say that in terms of quality of life, and this isn't, I know it may sound corny, but marrying Karen was the absolute most significant decision and determinant of quality of life that I possibly could have made, because she is a calm, strong, warm, loving force in life, and no matter what happens, I mean, absolutely no matter what happens, she is a person who is steadfast and serene and loving. And so when I think about quality of life in the context of family, it's nothing that I do. I'm a whirling vortex of waking up at all hours, trying to find out things, going, and as I told Karen recently, I'm on my way down to further south to go swimming with sharks for research for this book. And I'm always trying to push it to the edge in my pursuits. In terms of quality of life, she is a person who, she's, maybe the way of saying it is if one is lucky enough to choose well, then a big part of quality of life is answered just in the choosing. And then of course there's the part of wanting to sustain that and nurture that and nourish that and keep that fresh and strong. But I really think that that's a big part of it.
On the nourishment or nurture side, any little practices that you guys have, whether it's meeting for lunches during the day or anything along those lines that's works well for the marriage?
Yeah, I mean, not especially private, but I will tell you that when we were courting, she would always ask me, she would tease me about this thing that she called a radio show, because remember I shared with you that early in the morning I go off and I go do my gathering? Well, then I would return to cuddle with her and would report to her on all of my gathering, and she would be asleep. And she would call this the radio show because it was the equivalent of like a full show about what was happening in the world and all the places that I had just gone and all the interesting things that I had just discovered. And she would lie there and would listen to all of this almost as if it were a radio show in which I were telling her all the things that were happening in the world and ideas to think about for the day. I would absolutely say that the most important moments in our day when we're not with our son are those quiet moments on the pillow when we talk about stuff. And we're very focused on making sure that we have that time right there on the pillow to talk about the world and about our lives, about our son, our families, and what we're doing. That's critical. And we really make sure that not too many days go by that we've not spent some really good time just right there in that spot, that sacred spot, talking about our lives and what's happening. There's a wish from the Southwest that I once heard at a wedding about, may you grow old on the same pillow, and I think about that a lot.
Yeah, we went to a king-size bed a few years ago. That was a mistake. We got to go back to the queen soon. Let's open up some questions. Go in the audience, and I'll let Ben sort of moderate the questions.
Yes, sir.
Question about motivation, specifically in motivating your own children or members of your family. I'm kind of curious about, I've never been able to see how a parent can motivate a child. It seems like it has to be self-induced, but how do you create it seems like the only thing one can do is simply create an environment where it's safe for them to explore. Because if the motivation doesn't come from within, it seems like the wither on the vine.
It's a really good question. I'm not an expert. I'm a rookie. I've got a 5-year-old, but I can tell you something, an interesting story about a man I mentioned earlier, Dennis Charney, the guru of resilience studies at Mount Sinai. Dr. Charney is a brilliant man. He's the dean of Mount Sinai School of Medicine. He's a great healer, physician, leader in medicine. And he became interested in resilience studies around 20 years ago, I believe. And he has 5 children, as I recall. And his 5 children, grew the day that he became interested in resilience. And the reason is that as soon as he became interested in resilience and began to learn about how does one raise a resilient child, he became much more of a hard ass. And his kids didn't like it as much. That he was much more indulgent before he knew much about resilience, and that as soon as he found out about resilience and how to create that in a kid, he became much tougher. And so I think to your question about motivation, I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I think that the corollary involves, I think that we do have a lot to say to our kids, and we may not be able to drive them. It needs to come from inside. But when it comes to resilient children, Dr. Charney absolutely believes that many parents are too indulgent and go out of our way to solve the problems for our children, to make things perfect, to pick them up when they fall down, when in fact an important part of resilience is learning that you can do it yourself and learning that you can get back up on your feet after you fall down, and that life is going to knock you down and that you're going to be responsible for getting yourself back up. So it's not
Define a resilient child again.
Pardon me?
Define resilient child again.
So resilience is this capacity to, when you get bent out of shape, to reconstitute, to take your original shape, to return to your original shape, to bounce back. So I think one of the ideas that's very, very current and that there's been a lot of writing about is, how does one raise a resilient child? How does one raise a child who, when a child gets knocked down, when a child doesn't make a team in sports, when a child gets a bad grade, when a child struggles, how does the child become resilient? How does the child keep going and bounce back and carry on? And in fact, and there's lots and lots of literature on this. Some of it is genetic. Some kids are wired to get knocked down and pop right back up. And there's a lot of science on that. Some kids don't have those resilient genetics, and so there's much more of an environmental factor involved. So this whole field, as you all know, is called G times E, genes times environment. There's all this debate over the genes piece times the environmental piece, and which is more powerful in determining all sorts of things, from anxiety to intelligence to talent and aptitude to resilience. Is it your genes or is it the environment? Is it, to your point, sir, do your genes, proteins, do they drive motivation and performance and achievement in life, or is it environment? Or, as I think that science is increasingly discovering, is it the interaction of your environment, factors, your parents, your teachers, your life, interacting with the proteins that you have to create that result?
I want to follow up. What you just said something that rang a bell for me. It seems as if our society and the West is becoming more and more an entitlement society, which is opposed to this thing about resilience and letting people fail. We've just spent trillions of dollars not letting our so-called financial system fail. Not letting it be resilient.
Right. I was watching Vice President Biden on the Jon Stewart show last night, where I get a lot of my news and information. And I'm a recovering television producer, so that's got to get the news where you can get it. So let's not talk about the politics, because he made the point that if you let those institutions fail, you end up perhaps in a global depression, which would cause much more pain and problems. So politics aside, Dr. Charney's point is that, and other experts suggest, that our survival instincts, our resilience instincts, many of the things that make us tougher and better able to deal with the challenges in life, that the world around us has softened us in certain ways. There's a wonderful doctor named Ken